Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video, of course, by that of Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation, where, of course, he talks about Mr. Canelo Alvarez. And for those of you, of course, that do not know, Canelo Alvarez, he is, of course, going to fight the Puerto Rican prospect Mr. Edgar Berlanga, and I have to call him a prospect because he basically isn't anything else at this point in time in his career. And to be quite honest with you, he's been a little bit more disappointing in some of his most recent outings. Now, the card, in my view, it's a relatively great card. Not necessarily because of the main event, but although the main event it's gonna be, I'm sure, relatively exciting. But of course, this card actually is making up for a little bit because of some of the undercards. For example, like that of a Araceli Lara versus that of a Danny Garcia, which is probably the best fight on the card. And of course, I believe that Caleb Plant is going to be returning as well against an undefeated fighter, I believe, by the name of Trevor McCumbee. And of course, they're having that, little thing of the MAGA, conservative Donald Trump supporter white boy versus the Wigger white boy Caleb Plant. So I'm sure, of course, that will be a big fight that a lot of people are going to tune into. A lot of the fights on this card are pretty much perfectly promoted. And then, of course, you have Canelo Alvarez versus that of Edgar Berlanga, or Berlanga, however you pronounce his name, which is Mexico versus Puerto Rico. But the thing is that a lot of people, of course, and Oscar De La Hoya recently stated this in his quote-unquote clapback Thursdays or whatever it is that he does, whatever the fuck Oscar De La Hoya and his coked ass, is up to these days. But when it comes down to it overall, Oscar De La Hoya basically stated that he believes that Canelo Alvarez, that he's in a fight that pretty much nobody asked for, and I tend to agree with him. Even though, of course, the amount of respect that I have for Canelo as a fighter, and I think that he is an all-time great fighter, people are starting to get a little bit tired of this stick of being in fights to where pretty much you know that you're going to win, or a lot of people believe that Canelo is going to win anyway. So once again, Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to talk about it. Of course, he's going to stretch the truth a little bit, when it comes down, and of course, whenever it comes to Canelo Alvarez's career. But people are getting tired of Canelo Alvarez taking these fights that I'm not going to say they're quote unquote exhibition fights, but they're not the fights that everyone is asking for either. At the end of the day, when it came to the trilogy versus Gennady Golovkin, people pretty much knew, at least a lot of us knew, that Gennady Golovkin really was not at the same point in time in his career anymore. After that, I think that he fought Jermell Charlo, at least I believe. Or no, actually, after that, I think he fought John Ryder, which was a relatively entertaining fight. But everyone pretty much knew that John Ryder is not of the super big championship level caliber fighter. It just is what it is. And then, of course, after that, he fought Jermell Charlo, I believe, which was a relatively great fight to have. But, one that, of course, Canelo Alvarez was still expected to win. At least I expected him to win, and any of us that knew anything about the difference level of skill set and ability between that of Jermell Charlo and Canelo Alvarez, we pretty much expected Canelo Alvarez to dominate that fight. And of course, the fight right after that against Jaime Munguia, the last two fights I think were relatively entertaining, and I would claim that those guys were probably A grade level, at least A minus level when Canelo Alvarez had fought them. However, he still was pretty widely favored to win those fights. So at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez, it's very clear that he's taking fights right now to where, I'm not going to say once again that they're exhibition fights. I mean, this Edgar Berlanga fight, maybe you can claim that that's an exhibition fight. I'm not going to claim that the Jermell Charlo or the Jaime Munguia fights are exhibition fights because I think that those actually had some relative great matchup ability behind them and great entertainment behind them. But when it comes down to the overall, once again, Canelo was expected to clearly win those fights. And Canelo Alvarez, once again, even though he has a great career, people are getting tired of this stick of him being in fights that he clearly is going to be favored in to win. And I think that at the 168-pound weight class, that, in my view, that those are actually great fights, at least against Billy Joe Saunders and Callum Smith and Caleb Plant especially. I think that all those fights actually were necessary, and I think that all those added to Canelo Alvarez's resume, in my personal view, all those guys were at least on the A minus level. And I'll explain that as the video goes along. But when you talk about it, once again, this is not a fight that anyone asked for whatsoever. Of course, everyone is asking for the David Benavidez fight or that of the David Morrell fight, and Canelo Alvarez is going to have to give that to the people, or he's going to get a certain amount of criticism. And eventually, his star power is going to somewhat implode, or it's not going to be quite as what it once was, because he is not giving the fight that everyone wants to see with that of David Benavidez. But that being stated, Canelo Alvarez also is going to have to get paid out the wazoo in order to fight that of a David Benavidez. Canelo Alvarez takes a look at it and he says, I gave boxing some of the best fights and I have the best resume of this era. In my personal view, I'm the greatest fighter of this era. And if you want me to fight David Benavidez, someone that's going to be 20 plus pounds bigger than me on fight night, and someone overall that pretty much is a light heavyweight, and I'm not really even a natural super middleweight, you want me to fight a guy that you're trying to, basically groom as my replacement as the new face of Mexican or Mexican American boxing overall, then you're going to have to pay me for that fight if you really want that fight to happen. And in that sense, I don't really mind Canelo Alvarez overall doing that. But once again, he is going to have to try to take on either David Benavidez or David Morrell very soon. But we'll see what ends up happening. But anyways, let's get into the video. Let's see what Dante has to say.
Dontae's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So do you guys remember when Canelo Alvarez was being promoted by Oscar De La Hoya? And Oscar De La Hoya, he would come out defending Canelo Alvarez for avoiding everybody at 154 or 160. But there came a time when even Oscar De La Hoya, he would say things to hint that Canelo Alvarez, he needs to fight against a Demetrius Andrade at 154, against a Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade at 160. Oscar's exact words back then was, if Canelo Alvarez wants to be one of the...
Well, let me comment on that very quickly. Because Dante, of course, whenever he talks about Canelo Alvarez, he makes Canelo Alvarez sound like he's just avoided every single fighter that has ever been in his path. And of course, that is not the case. You cannot have the resume of a Canelo Alvarez and just duck and dodge everybody and overall have the type of resume that a Canelo Alvarez has. Is just not possible. It is what it is. So at the end of the day, once again, overall, the man, when he was at 154, he fought Austin Trout. He fought that of an Araceli Lara. He had a couple of other good fights there as well. When the man was at 160, he fought Miguel Cotto. He fought Gennady Golovkin. He fought Danny Jacobs. When he was at 168, the man fought Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, Caleb Plant. He also fought Sergey the Crusher Kovalev. And there's a multitude of other fighters that he has fought as well. Give the man at least a little bit of his just due. Now, if you, of course, want to talk about the Andrade fight not happening or the Charlo fight not happening, that's up to you when it comes down to it. But to be quite honest with you, the Jamal Charlo fight did not happen. That was really up to Jamal Charlo. Jamal Charlo, I believe, had turned down a deal from Canelo Alvarez and De La Hoya many years ago. I believe that even he and his brother had said so himself. And of course, in recent years, when he was offered it, even before this, recent depression that he was seeped into, Jamal Charlo, apparently he was not up to it. So it is what it is. And recently, it was actually supposed to be Jamal Charlo in the ring with Canelo, but it had to be Jamel because Jamal Charlo was not up to the task mentally. And Jamal, unfortunately, for him, he looks like a done fighter. But we'll see what ends up happening. Now, Andrade, of course, Andrade was a little bit of a different situation because I don't think that Canelo was ever truly interested in getting in the ring with Andrade, at least not to a super great deal. But at the end of the day, I can't really blame Canelo Alvarez too much because Andrade is a guy to where, he's known a little bit throughout that of the boxing scene. But Andrade is a guy to where, he's a very high-risk type of fighter, but he brings almost no reward whatsoever. Because almost no one knows who he is, at least when you talk about casual boxing fans. A lot of people know who he is, of course, if you're a boxing aficionado or if you've watched him box. But at the end of the day, Demetrius Bubo Andrade was a guy that was always going to be very high risk and very low reward. And unfortunately, Demetrius Andrade, who kind of got in his own way, didn't really get any big fights before that at David Benavidez. And unfortunately, Demetrius Andrade is going to be remembered as one of the more unfortunate stories within that of boxing. Because he probably could have had a better career overall had he made a little bit of better decisions to sign with that Al Heyman in the PBC, where in my view he could have got some bigger fights or tried to take on some other fights, but it just didn't end up happening, unfortunately. And of course he ended up pulling out of the Jamel Charlo fight at one point in time, of course because he thought that he was getting lowballed, but in my view it just would have been good to take that fight at the moment because the man overall, once again, I just think that it would have done a lot for his career. But it is what it is. Anyways.
Great. He's going to have to fight the likes of a Demetrius Andrade and a Jamal Charlo. Now, keep in mind, this is when Canelo Alvarez was at 160, and Canelo, he said that he wanted to become undisputed at 160. But he said this before Andre became a champion at 160 and Jamal Charlo became his mandatory at 160. So once Andrade and Jamal Charlo crashed the party at 160, this is when Canelo Alvarez conveniently changed his mind and no longer cared about being undisputed. That's when he moved up to 168 and went after all the C-level white/European fighters to become undisputed.
Right, but let me also state this very quickly. Because DontaesBoxingNation once again tries to make it sound like Canelo Alvarez was fighting these just complete bums at the 168-pound weight class. At the end of the day, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, and that of Caleb Plant, none of those guys are C-grade level fighters. Billy Joe Saunders, at the end of the day, was able to defeat that of an Andy Lee, who was a former champion. Someone who had a draw and overall had a belt. Someone who had a draw against that of Peter Quillen when he was looked at as a decent fighter at one point in time. Now, Andy Lee, in my view, was never an A-grade level fighter or champion, but he was a solid B-grade contender. Billy Joe Saunders was able to beat Chris Eubank Jr. He was able to beat that of he was able to beat that of David Lemieux, who was a former champion. Billy Joe Saunders had completely won every single round against David Lemieux, had completely embarrassed him, and of course he was also able to defeat that of Andy Lee and a couple of other guys. That's what Billy Joe Saunders was able to do. And Billy Joe Saunders, when he was looked at the 160-pound weight class, he was up there as one of the more dangerous 160-pound contenders. And let's not forget, when Billy Joe Saunders versus Andrade was signed as a big fight, Dante's Boxing Nation was calling that one of the best and one of the biggest fights of the year. But I'm supposed to believe that Billy Joe Saunders is a quote-unquote C-grade level fighter. And then when it comes to Caleb Plant, once again, a quote-unquote C-grade level Caucasian fighter. But when he's about to fight David Benavidez, even after Canelo Alvarez recently knocked him out, I'm supposed to believe that Caleb Plant is a quote-unquote C-grade level fighter. But when he fights David Benavidez, is one of the best and one of the biggest fights of the year. You know, the guy that apparently is going to destroy Canelo Alvarez. Does that make any sense?
I bring all this up to tell you guys, or remind you guys, that I used to tell you all the time back then when Oscar...
Now, if you want to talk about John Ryder, if you want to talk about Avni Yildirim, if you want to talk about, who the hell was that other dude? Rocky Fielding? Yeah, those guys were C to B grade level fighters. But not Callum Smith, not Caleb Plant, and not Billy Joe Saunders. Those guys were at least on the A- level. And once again, for so many of the Demetrius Andrade fans, or so many of these channels talking shit about how good Demetrius Andrade was, the man was allegedly supposed to be 10 times better than Caleb Plant, and the man ended up putting up 10 times less the fight of a Caleb Plant. Caleb Plant was actually able to give David Benavidez quite a bit of a run for his money. He was able to, at the very least, in my view, win 4 rounds in that fight. Could have even debated maybe 5 rounds within that fight. When it came down to it against David Benavidez, he didn't get knocked down and he didn't get knocked out. He didn't get stopped. Andrade got stopped in the 3rd round, I believe, and he overall got the shit kicked out of him after the 3rd round. And he got stopped after 6 rounds. So I don't want to hear this shit about how Andrade was 10 times better than Caleb Plant. I've always been saying this for the past several years. Caleb Plant and Andrade were about on the same level. And to be quite honest with you, Caleb Plant might even be above Andrade. Because Caleb Plant has more champions on his resume than what Andrade has. And on top of that, the man was actually able to put up a fight against David Benavidez. I mean, no offense against Andrade, but other than the first 2 rounds, man had nothing left after that.
Was promoting Canelo Alvarez.
And that's not me saying that Andrade still would have not been an A-grade level fighter for Canelo to fight, or still would have not been a very decent fight for Canelo Alvarez to take. But can we please stop this bullshit about how Andrade was 10 times better than Caleb Plant, or how Caleb Plant is this alleged C-grade white boy and all this other bullshit? Well, that C-grade white boy overall once again gave David Benavidez, the Mexican monster, so far the toughest fight in his career. Let's not forget that, at least when you talk about him being in more of his peak years.
That he really wants to come out and expose Canelo Alvarez for who he really is. But he couldn't do it back then because he was promoting Canelo, obviously. I said to you guys, there's going to be a time when Oscar De La Hoya is no longer working with Canelo Alvarez, and that's when he's going to do a complete tell-all. And that is exactly what he's doing every day now. And you guys can't say, oh, he's just saying this because they don't like each other. That's not true, because he doesn't like Floyd Mayweather. But Oscar De La Hoya, even though he disses Floyd Mayweather, he always puts respect on his name when it comes to what Floyd Mayweather has accomplished in the ring. He always says that Floyd Mayweather is the best to ever do it. He's the greatest of all.
That's great, but Canelo Alvarez's and Oscar De La Hoya's relationship is a little bit different. Oscar De La Hoya is going to feel more betrayed from that of Canelo Alvarez because in Oscar De La Hoya's mind, he built up Canelo Alvarez to a certain degree. In fact, in Oscar De La Hoya's mind, he believes that he built up Canelo completely. Now, of course, that's not necessarily, the truth of the situation. Of course, he helped build up Canelo a little bit, but he didn't build him up completely. But, when it comes down to the overall, once again, overall, Oscar De La Hoya, you can tell, is a little bit bitter towards Canelo Alvarez. And he also being a Mexican fighter, at least a Mexican-American fighter, and Canelo being from Mexico, there's a little bit of a difference, vibe between the two of them than what there is between De La Hoya and Mayweather. So it's going to be a little bit different. Now, is that me stating that Oscar De La Hoya does not necessarily believe in some of the stuff that he's saying about Canelo? No. But at the end of the day, once again, there is a little bit of bitterness, towards Canelo there from Oscar. And Oscar has even admitted that himself.
Time. And you seldomly ever hear that kind of praise from an arch rival. What I mean is Joe Louis, he never called Muhammad Ali the greatest. Roberto Duran or Tommy Hearns, they didn't call Sugar Ray Leonard the greatest. That is a stark contrast from what Oscar De La Hoya is doing when it comes to Floyd Mayweather. So when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, I like the fact that Oscar De La Hoya is probably one of the only Mexicans that is not staying on Mexican code to try to defend and protect Canelo Alvarez no matter what he does. For example, Jose Benavidez Sr., David Benavidez's father and trainer. To a certain extent, Sr. would still stay on Mexican code to kind of defend Canelo, despite Canelo disrespecting their whole family and avoiding his son. He would still say stuff like, Canelo, he's the best fighter in the world, and he's reached the point to where he can fight whoever he wants to fight. And he's...
Right, so it's staying on quote-unquote Mexican code to say that Canelo Alvarez is the best fighter in the world. This is why, once again, that Dante, you have to be a little bit careful with what he says. Because so much of his shit is racially motivated and based in bitterness that if you call a non-black fighter the quote-unquote best fighter in the world, he's immediately going to go after you and claim that that is a racial motivation. And a lot of the times, to be fair, it can be. But Canelo Alvarez right now, you still could debate as the best fighter in the world. In my view, I wouldn't say that he is, at least at the moment with his recent fights. I would say that it's probably Crawford or Usyk. Probably Usyk right now, but Crawford, of course, has a great debate. And in a way, in my view, is slightly behind them. But the thing is that Canelo Alvarez, he has earned a little bit in some sort of right to fight whoever he wants to. But also at the end of the day, the man has every single belt, at least most of the belts, at the 168-pound weight class. I'm not sure if the IBF belt is still with him or not. I cannot remember. But, when it comes down to the overall, Canelo Alvarez is going to have to fight the guys that people ask him to fight, especially when he has belts.
Willing to stay on code, even though they want to...
You can't completely use this excuse about who you fought several years ago, and then use that overall once again to not fight certain guys as of now. That's not how professional sports works.
Fight him. But that's not Oscar. In Oscar's recent video that he put out about Canelo Alvarez, or mainly about Canelo Alvarez, he said a lot of things that were true, but there were some things he said that I slightly disagree with. Let me play this clip.
Hey again, it's your favorite time of the week again. It's time for the only segment in boxing that gives you the facts and makes you laugh. It's Clapback Thursdays. The boxing news is still slow this week, but as always, I got creative because I realized it's the best part of your boring week. So let's go! Okay, so we're a week away from the boxing match that nobody asked for, right? And the UFC event that everybody will be watching. Canelo's fighting Berlanga. Another snooze fest. They're trying to sell a pay-per-view for
I'm going to be interested to see overall how well the UFC numbers do compared to that of the Canelo Alvarez weekend. Now, according to certain statistics that I'm hearing, Canelo Alvarez is kicking the ass of UFC's pay-per-view right now, or at least overall with the quote-unquote seats. Which, once again, of course, he basically tried to do that overall in order to kind of get one over on Canelo or get one overall somewhat on boxing. But, of course, when you talk about Canelo Alvarez, that's not a smart thing to do because he just has such a big following. So, but it's going to be interesting because, one of the bigger stars is going to be fighting on that card, Mr. Sugar Sean O'Malley. And he's going to be making a very interesting title defense over Merab Dvalishvili, I believe, or whoever that one Georgian fighter is, that one Georgian wrestler who comes from, that one New York camp, the Weidman and Aljamain Sterling camp. It's going to be a very particularly interesting fight. That's actually a great card. I'm going to have to watch both of those fight cards. But I do believe that more than likely that Canelo will get the greater numbers, but I'm not quite sure how great of numbers he's going to get.
$8 at $500 minimum in person? It's just robbery at this point to pay for another lame Canelo fight that always goes the distance against a subpar opponent.
While it is true that Canelo does usually go the distance with subpar opponents, Berlanga is even weaker opposition than Jaime Munguia and John Ryder was. So there's no way this fight is supposed to go the distance when...
Well, I think that he's quote-unquote weaker than that of a Jaime Munguia. I'm not really quite sure if he's weaker than that of a John Ryder. Edgar Berlanga, in my view, is probably a solid B grade level fighter. I don't think that he's an A grade level fighter. In my view, Jamel Charlo and Jaime Munguia, I give Canelo Alvarez A- level credit for that. Jaime Munguia has been a legitimate champion before he did beat Sergey Derevyanchenko. He also was able to beat that of John Ryder. Now, of course, neither of those guys, in my view, are A grade level fighters either, but they're solid B grade level fighters. And to be fair, Jaime Munguia did have the best performance in his career last time against that of a John Ryder. And Jaime Munguia, on top of that, that boy should be fighting at 168 anyway. That dude is huge. I don't know how the hell that dude ever made 154 pounds before. But anyways, when it comes down to, once again, Jaime Munguia was a legitimate A- level fighter. So was Jamel Charlo, because once again, Jamel Charlo was really more of a natural middleweight, as is Canelo. So once again, that's why I don't really give Jamel Charlo the major excuse. I give him a little bit of a valid excuse for moving up 2 weight classes, but I don't give him as much of an excuse as what some other people do, because Jamel Charlo really should be fighting at 160 anyway. And it's the same thing, with Canelo. Canelo should also be fighting at 160.
Look at Berlanga's history. This man has been knocked out and hurt really bad multiple times in the amateurs. Honestly, this fight shouldn't go past 3 rounds. At least it's not supposed to.
Well, in my view, 3 rounds is a little bit overall. Once again, that's a little bit much. But Dante, of course, is going to try to make Canelo Alvarez look as bad as possible, because more than likely this fight, either if he does get a stoppage, it's going to be late, or it's going to be more than likely, going to a contest. But Canelo Alvarez is just getting older as a fighter. And that's just the signs overall as a fighter that's getting a little bit older. They get stoppages over certain opponents, or they're able to, to somewhat, show their great power. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they just don't have quite as much anymore. They're not as fast to the punch. Their power, it still may be effective, but maybe not quite as effective as what it was before, especially because they don't have, the same rhythm anymore, or they don't have the same snap. They don't have the same speed. And Canelo Alvarez has looked aged to me now for the past couple of years at the very least. So I expect this fight, if he does stop Edgar Berlanga, more than likely to stop him in the latter rounds. I'm going to predict Canelo to stop him in the latter rounds. But you never know. Edgar Berlanga is bigger. He is a natural 168-pounder, and he's relatively powerful. But that being said, I just think that he's way too hittable and way too flawed and way too inexperienced to really beat that of a Canelo.
When it comes to this level of opposition. Now, Canelo Alvarez has gone the distance in his last 5 fights. When it comes to fighters like John Ryder, Jaime Munguia, and a 40-year-old Gennady Golovkin, we know for a fact if Crawford was fighting against those guys, I'm talking about they're naturally the same weight, Crawford would have knocked them all out. But Canelo, he couldn't do it.
I'll actually be attending.
Well, I think that Crawford could have knocked out some of those guys speculatively, but you never know, because in all honesty, Terrence Bud Crawford was not able to stop the last opponent, a fighter that I thought that he should have been able to stop, Mr. Israel Madrimov. So it is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to the overall, Dante does bring up an interesting point overall about Crawford potentially being able to stop those guys. But the thing is with Jaime Munguia is that Jaime Munguia was at least a weight class bigger than Canelo at the very least. And on top of that, like I said, Canelo's just aging as a fighter. He just is.
The UFC event atmosphere instead. So now, I love the sport of boxing more than anything, and I will be watching boxing matches anywhere and anytime, even if it's a simple sparring session or 2 bums fighting in the street. So the idea I'm choosing to attend the UFC and support Dana White instead of Canelo tells you everything you need to know. Dana, I can't wait to see you next Saturday, buddy. I see that you got the same ab surgery I got. I always knew you wanted to be like me, bro. It will be great to hang out with you face to face. Let's go!
Let me close.
By the way, the last time Oscar De La Hoya and Dana White talked, apparently Dana hated his ass. You can go look it up on the ESPN interview, but I'm not really sure overall what their relationship is like now.
Close out by saying this. I don't believe that the UFC is going to do better numbers than the Canelo Alvarez fight. But at the same time, I don't believe that Canelo versus Berlanga is going to be a success, because it's still a fight that no one asked for. But with that being said, boxing in general usually does better than UFC pay-per-views. Not to mention, if Canelo Alvarez is...
Well, it depends overall, once again, on what you count as a quote-unquote success. I expect this fight to do at least 300, to 500,000 pay-per-view buys. And once again, it's very particularly interesting that Dante and none of these LDBs here, new media channels, had talked about how Gervonta Tank Davis, fighting against that of Frank Martin with David Benavidez on the undercard, how that fight only did 350,000 pay-per-view buys. Very particularly interesting how no one talks about that.
Pay-per-view numbers are low, they're not even going to be reported. You guys have to understand, when the only people that's talking about the pay-per-view numbers are people on Twitter, or you Google Canelo Alvarez pay-per-view numbers against Berlanga, and the only thing that pops up is Reddit or some boxing forum, that means they don't have official numbers. When a pay-per-view is extremely successful, they usually report the numbers very early, and it's on every major boxing website. Not just, once again, some random guy saying these are the numbers on the internet. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. Thought that was very particularly interesting. But thank you guys so much for watching overall. We'll see where this goes. But I do understand the frustration that many people are having with Canelo Alvarez, because at the end of the day, the man does retain all the belts, or he holds most of the belts at 168 pounds, whatever has happened in most recent times, and he is not giving the fights that people want to see at the most recent time. I think Jaime Munguia and Jamel Charlo, I think that those were doable fights. I think that overall that those were two fights that were very good. But of course, the fight that everybody wants to see is Mr. David Benavidez or David Morrell. So we'll see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.